if indeed it has worked, if indeed people are able to implement this, then it would help very greatly, particularly in those establishments where they may not exactly be very particular about time. They might take their time in having to give approvals. And of course, you can depend on this executive order. But we would point out, which is one of the recommendations we would make, this executive order is not a legislation. And there is no indication that it overrides the enabling legislation of the several other departments and agencies. Take, for example, you have, and I would give the fairly common one, that you have the Investment and Securities Act, which is the enabling legislation for SEC. And you're supposed to apply for something for SEC, and SEC does not give you that approval within that time. It would be very difficult in law to argue that simply because of this executive order, it overrides that discretion that is in the ISA for SEC to give you their approval at their own time. In other words, without bringing or amending the provisions in SEC, in the ISA, for example, it is very difficult to enforce this executive order, particularly on agencies and departments that were created by legislation and who have enabling legislation for their various activities. Perhaps this is an area that the government itself should look into. Now, the other aspect that the government, perhaps this executive order does not particularly cover, is where you have competing agencies attempting to do the same thing, sometimes because of revenue generation. And in the process, they stifle business. They stifle the progress of the manufacturing sector, for example. Now, this has not particularly addressed that. There is no harmonization that has been done in regard to those types of agencies. That is also something that needs to be addressed by government. But of course, it starts from the association, manufacturing association, for example, having to highlight that there are some of those areas where there are lacunas, where there are still some clogs or challenges because of different agencies or departments essentially doing the same thing or competing with each other as far as regulation is concerned. The other area that we had highlighted relates to tax and multiplicity of tax. Now, this is a common problem that is also inherent in our federal system. And this is because the federal system allows the different tiers, the federal, the state, the local government, to raise funds through taxation. And in the more recent past, particularly given the shortage in revenue from oil, there has been quite a concentration on taxation by the different tiers of government. Now, necessarily, because all of them are looking for money, that leads to the incident of multiplicity of taxation. It is not quite clear what the government intends to do about this. I personally believe that it is necessary that the three tiers of government, and as relevant, the departments, should meet and harmonize. Without having to do that, and without any clear-cut policy on it, it is very difficult to see how this can be reduced. However, what we have seen in terms of the ease of doing business is that the Federal Inland Revenue has upgraded to the Integrated Tax Administration System, which allows taxpayers to submit their tax filings, their returns online, and also use the e-platform for the purposes of payments. Now, that does not at all address the issue of multiplicity. It simply addresses the ease of having to make the payments. And then, of course, well, there's legislation on that one. Sometimes there are challenges as to how much is being taxed and disputes. That one, of course, the issues are not exclusively that of FIRS. They also go to the issue of justice administration and the time that it takes for cases to be determined by the courts. Sometimes it takes much longer, particularly in the appellate courts. The courts of first instance, that is the high courts, these days, because of the fast-track approach, matters could easily get concluded 6 months, not more than a year, depending on the counsel that is handling it. But at the appellate level, because they have quite a congregation of matters, the number of matters before them, that takes quite some bit of time. Now, there is also the issue in regard to trading across borders and the port control efforts. What the government had envisaged as far as the ports are concerned was that there would be a streamlining of the agencies that are at the ports, that are checking goods, etc., and that would make the evacuation of imported things, raw materials, etc., from the ports quite fast. I am not too sure that that has really been achieved. It would be good to hear from others what has been achieved. But what we know is that even assuming that that has been achieved, as the chairman pointed out, we still have the challenge in regard to the traffic gridlock, particularly in the Apapa corridor. And what that means is, even if you have gained something in the swing, that is in the process for the purposes of having to evacuate your goods from the ports, you lose it, if not completely, but largely, as far as getting it out and passing through the Apapa corridor is concerned.
When we come back after the break, we'll look at the equities market. To stay with us.